Hello and welcome to this new episode of Benchmarks in Transition. In this episode we will discuss overnight benchmarks and in particular what is happening in euro and dollar where the old benchmark, EONIA and Fed funds are moved to new benchmarks overnight, ESTER and SOFR. Enjoy! In this transition of overnight benchmarks, we will look at the dollar side and the euro side. So let's start with the dollar. The current main benchmark in dollar is the effective Fed fund rate, which has been published by the Fed since 54. So that's probably the oldest benchmark that we are using. And this is unsecured lending between a large bank, and it is the median rate of actual transaction. So let's look at the rate over the last years, so the last 2 years. You can see that the rates are following quite closely the monetary policies. And not only the rate itself is published, but also the 25 and 75 percentile. What you can see on the screen is actually that you don't see those 25 and 75. It is because if I go to the website of the Fed, and I looked at the actual rate, so that's the rate over the last days, and maybe 1 month ago, if you look at the difference between the 75 and 25 percentile, what you see usually is a very small bid offer, 1 or 2 basis points. Now, if you look at the last days, what happened with the crisis, then that bid offer increased up to 10 basis points, but that's the not natural situation. Notice also the size of the underlying volume. You have something between 100 and 75 or so billion a day. That's roughly the size of the volume underlying that benchmark. Let's move at the new one, the SOFR, Secured Overnight Financing Rate, which has been published since a little around 2 years. And this is also a median rate based also on actual transaction, but underlying it there is some kind of expert judgment in a sense that I will explain later. The transition between those two benchmarks will be an open-ended multi-step transition that will be described in a couple of minutes. So let's look at the rate itself. What you can see, so that's the last 2 years since SOFR is published. In the background, you still have the effective Fed fund rate in blue, but you almost don't see it. On top of it, you have SOFR, which is roughly following the same pattern. But what you can see is that in general, there is a larger bid offer. The difference between the 25 and the 75 percentiles is larger, and there are more movements, more volatility. So let's look also at the website. So if you take the data from, let's say, 1 month ago, you can see that the bid offer, the 75, 25 percentile, is something around 5 to 10 basis points. That's the order of magnitude. But if you look at the last day with the crisis, it was almost zero and even have some negative rates on the 1% percentile. And the level of the notional underlying those rates is something like 1,000 billion. So it's more than 10 times larger than the Fed fund notional. If we look at the description of the index or the benchmark on the website,
one sentence that I found was interesting is the fact that for some of the data, there is 25% of the data which is removed because it is supposed to represent some special traits. So that's why I say it's also expert judgment based, because there is an expert judgment at the start to decide which trait is selected to compute this rate. And then once the trades are selected, it's transaction based, where we take the median of those rates. So let's go back to the graph themselves, and I will look at first what happened around September and November. If you may remember, there were quite big movement in the repo market at those dates. So if we take this period around the 15th of September, the rates, the SOFR rates were volatile. There is even one day, the 17th of September, which is not on the screen because the rates on that day were around 5%. But in general, you see a larger bid offer and a movement, like this movement at month's end, or these movements around the 15th of the month. So that was what happened around September. Because of those movements, bid offers, and jumps, the Fed intervened. And if we take 2 months just after, this is the same scale, so going from 1.5 to 3.5%, the same scale. But in this period, in December to February, there were no change of monetary policy, but there was a big intervention by the Fed, around 100 billion repo offered by the Fed on a daily basis, and you see that in that period the rates were completely flat, almost no bid offer, and almost no volatility, even at month's end or even at year end, which was in that period. So the rates underlying the benchmark are influenced by monetary policy, by political decision. Now, if we take a look at the comparison over a longer period, the last 5 years, first on the SOFR side, it exists only since April 18, so somewhere here, but for the couple of years before, there were pre-SOFR rate published retroactively, so it's the same computation as SOFR, but done after the fact. But let's ignore that. What you see is that on the effective Fed fund rates, they are following quite clearly the monetary policy, but there was a time, let's say, look at it here, where the rates were not constant. They were spikes down at month's end because the Fed was injecting more liquidity. And if you look at that period, then you see the opposite. The Fed fund rates were very stable, but the SOFR rates had spikes. So the situation, the way those rates behave, depend really on decision of the Fed. So that's why it will be difficult to move from one to the other, because we don't know exactly what will be the future policy, the future decision around those rates. What was the plan for the transition? That was the plan written by the ARC, the Alternative Reference Rate Committee, in 2017. Let's say a expected type of plan. First, you create the infrastructure. That was in 2018. You have first trades taking place. In May 18, there were already futures on SOFR traded. Then you start to offer step 3 OTC products, OIS. That started, the first transaction started in July 18. Then step 4, the idea was to offer the choice between the old and the new rates for collateral or price alignment interest at the CCP. That was planned for Q1 2020. The first transaction with price alignment interest on SOFR were done in October 18 at CME, but it was not a choice, it was a mandatory SOFR PAI for SOFR swaps. The next step should have been to no longer accept new contract on the old rate, on the old Fed fund rates for price alignment interest. Apparently, the decision has now been taken to not offer that flexibility, but to have a big bang one-off transition from one to the other somewhere in Q4 this year, in October, but that will be the subject of the next episode of our discussion. So let's leave the discussion about step 4 and 5 for the next time. And the last step should be to start to create a term rate around SOFR. Again, this is expected for later, probably at the end of 2021. So that's the situation on the dollar side. On the euro side, we have also two benchmarks, the old and the new. The old one is EONIA, Euro Overnight Index Average, which is published by a private company, EMMI, European Money Market Institute, and is published since January 1999. So that's since the euro exists. This is unsecured interbank lending, and the rate is an average rate by opposition to the median in the dollar case. The new benchmark is the Euro STR, Euro short-term rate, which is published by the ECB, the central banks, and exists since October 2019. It is unsecured, but this time wholesale lending, so at which rate banks borrow from their customers, and it is also a volume-weighted mean, but a trim mean, and it is a mean of actual transaction. The transition between EONIA ESTER is different from the one in dollar, and it is a time-limited recalibration approach with spread and clean discounting. So let's explain what that means. So this new rate has been published since October 2019, and the change will be done through a recalibration with spread. What does that mean? So EONIA had a certain methodology, and on that date, the 2nd of October, the methodology of EONIA was changed, and now EONIA still exists, but is not an independent number. It is ESTER, so Euro short-term rate, plus a fixed spread. So today, EONIA, which is published, is ESTER plus 5.5 basis points. So it's a fixed spread that has been computed in May last year and has been fixed forever. So where is this number coming from? So let's look at historical data. So this is historical data. In light blue, it's actual EONIA with the EONIA definition, and the yellow is pre-ESTER numbers. So numbers computed also by the ECB with a similar methodology to ESTER, but number that should not be used as a benchmark, should not be used in transaction, but can be used for economic matrix analysis. So what we can see in this period, before EONIA ESTER existed, is that both the EONIA and the pre-ESTER were fairly constant with not too much volatility. You have to look at the scale. Here it's minus 35 to minus 45 basis points. So the jump you see, it's actually a jump of 1 or 2 basis points, so a lot less volatility than in dollar. So that difference was fairly constant, and that's from this historical data that the decision to fix the spread to 8.5 was done. But what actually happened on exactly that date happened around that date in October. But before looking at what is important, let's look at what is not important. What is not important is what happened there. It seems that there is a kind of continuation between the yellow and the blue around here, but this is just an error of history. The blue is EONIA, the yellow is ESTER, and there was a monetary policy change at that date that was roughly 10 basis points, but there is no reason for the yellow to continue into the blue. What is important is what happened here. So this is the yellow ESTER or pre-ESTER computed with a certain methodology, and the next day the red one, which is the same methodology but now becoming official. So there is a continuation, and that's we see no jump. Then what happened in EONIA here is that the last light blue is an actual EONIA computation. The first dark blue is ESTER plus 8.5. What we see is that there is a small change, a small jump down by around 1 basis point. So the continuation from ESTER, from EONIA to EONIA adjusted, EONIA recalibrated seems to be acceptable. So that's just for this date, this smoothing of the two time series. Obviously now we cannot compare anymore ESTER to EONIA because EONIA does not exist anymore as an independent number. It is just ESTER plus a constant. So there is no way to compare it now, but at least on that date it was relatively smooth. Now, the next step is to what is called the clean discounting regime. We'd like to have only one potential price alignment interest or collateral. So that will happen, at least it is planned to happen next June, that the CCP will change from one to the other. This is less of a problem than in dollar because the spread is constant, but we will discuss that in the next presentation. In terms of liquidity, in theory, we should have expected the old liquidity from EONIA to move to ESTER, because now EONIA is just ESTER plus a constant. This is not really what we see. If I take the numbers from LCH since the beginning of the year, we can see that the notional traded on OIS is, in the first 3 months of the year, around 25,000 billion, which is roughly the same amount as in Euribor swaps. But if we look at the ESTER, only ESTER, what we can see, and for that we have currently only the figure for January and February, not yet for March, but what we can see is it is around 200 billion amounts. So on one side, 25,000 billion, that's for 3 months, roughly 8,000 billion amounts versus 200. So really, there is a lot less ESTER transaction than EONIA, even if EONIA is just a derivative of ESTER today. So there, the transition has not really happened. Also, on the euro side, there is a time-limited recalibration, meaning that at some stage, EONIA will stop. EONIA is planned not to be published anymore as of the 3rd of January 2022. That's when the European Union benchmark regulation take the full effect. What will happen on that date? That's not very clear. Contracts related to EONIA, and there are plenty of them that will go beyond 2022, will need a fallback. Exactly how, that's not yet decided. From a quantitative perspective, it's easy. Just write EONIA equal ESTER plus 8.5. That's already the case. But from a legal perspective, that may be a little bit more complex. And the same for indirect use of EONIA, like in CSA. So there is still some work to be done on the your side. And with this, we finish this episode on the transition, and we will restart soon with another episode. In the meantime, you can find, as usual, the slides at this address, and you feel free to contact me for any questions.